On behalf of the Amistad Center for Art and Culture and the Wadsworth Athenaeum, welcome to tonight's conversation with two remarkable scholars, Zeynep Çelik and Nilika Jawad, alongside matrix artist Todd Gray. They'll be in discussion around their research and work on the transatlantic slave trade, imperial gardens, classification systems, and colonial photography. There's just not enough time to review all of the incredible accomplishments of our three speakers tonight, but I'm pleased to introduce them briefly. Zeynep Çelik is an architectural historian whose work focuses on the history and theory of architecture since the Enlightenment. Çelik is the author of Kinesthetic Knowing, Aesthetics, Epistemology, Modern Design. She co-edited Design Techniques, Archaeologies of Architectural Practice, a collection of essays that examine the histories of design techniques. She's also published in numerous journals and is currently at work on a new book that explores 19th century architecture of bureaucracy from the Kew Herbarium to the Larkin Administration Building. Next, Nilika Jawad is an associate professor of English at the State University of New York, Oswego, and a research associate at the University of Johannesburg. She's a recipient of the 2018 Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant for a book project on Afropix, a South African photographers agency that operated during the last decade of apartheid. And artist Todd Gray. Todd Gray works between Los Angeles and Ghana, where he explores the diasporic dislocations and cultural connections which link Western dominance with West Africa, Black masculinity, and contemporary and historical examinations of power. Gray has received numerous awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship and a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio residency. His work is held in collections worldwide, and he has participated in numerous solo and group exhibitions at venues including the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Whitney Biennial, Panama College Museum of Art, the National Portrait Gallery in London, and the Grand Palais in Paris. Welcome, Zeynep, Nilika, and Todd. As we move through the conversation tonight, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll be monitoring to the chat and bringing them to the attention of the speakers. Todd, did you want to begin tonight with making a few opening remarks?
Well, yes, I would, and showing some images, just a couple, but thank you so much, Kimberly. And I'm really honored to be part of this panel, although not the main attraction of what the work is. So let me just jump right on in and let you share some thoughts about Euclidean Grigri. Euclidean Grigri is something I came up with from my Guggenheim grant. And so what I'm actually showing you here is an artwork called Euclidean Grigri. And it really encompasses my thinking about myself located in the diaspora, the Euclidean, the Western thinking, the logic, mathematics, Euclid, the father of geometry, but you do know that he studied with the Egyptians, as all the great Greek scholars did back then. However, let me get back on track. So the ultra-rational, that's the Euclidean, and how I was trained through scholarship and so forth. And then there's the Grigri. The Grigri is from an African spiritual tradition. It's also called Juju. In the Haitians, I think in Voodoo, it's called Grigri. But basically, it's a talisman that can protect you, or it can harm someone. So it can encompass good spirits or bad spirits. And for me, though, I'm thinking of Grigri as the non-rational, not irrational, but non-rational, the spiritual, the intuition, the subjective, as opposed to the Euclidean, where everything is objective and proven and so forth. So in this image, you can see on the vertical axis, I've turned this is a garden in Belgium, and I've turned it on its side. And that is referencing the grid, the logic of this particular garden in Belgium. And then you see I've created a body out of this construct of photographs. There are 4 photographs that I've put together to reference a body. And for me, that body is between the West, between Europe, America, and between Africa or West Africa. And that's signified by that red jacket, who we all know. That's an icon. That's the most recognizable diasporic African, that's ever been. And then you have at the bottom an African dancer with the grass skirt in a ritual performance. And so it's those tensions that come together. And then of course, the top is referencing the head, and that's the stars and the cosmos and so forth, all infinite possibility. So this was the first work that I made referencing Euclidean Grigri. Here's another one that came later as my thinking became more expansive. And in the middle, in the oval-shaped photograph, is a hooded statue at Versailles in France. And in behind, you see a trellis of grids, a gridded trellis. And so that really talks about containment, control, and you could sort of infer strange fruit. You could infer all sorts of really horrible historical events that have happened to people of color, with the rope around their neck and so forth. So for me, this is a really strong signifier of the violence, colonial violence, and so forth. And then the background is a bamboo forest that is in Ghana. And of course, framing it, there are some frames that I found in Goodwill stores, in secondhand shops in South LA, garage sales in South LA, and South Los Angeles is predominantly Black and brown individuals. Well, and it is changing, it's getting gentrified, but historically it's been predominantly people of color. So this is a really good example of Euclidean Grigri. Let me show you something else. Here is a recent image, a recent work, and it is 3 framed photographs. In the very background is a pavilion in Versailles, pavilion made from Marie Antoinette. And then the vertical portrait is an artist in Nigeria. Her name is Nike I'm having a lapse. But anyway, I wanted to show these tensions of design, tensions, visual tensions. Also make reference here, you have someone, a female power who is this artist Nike from Nigeria. And of course, signifying the Imperial West in the architecture in Versailles is that pavilion. Let's see. Actually, my exhibition at the Wadsworth, I did a extensive walkthrough, and it's online. And I believe it might show up in the chat if you want to go there. But I talk extensively about the work in that exhibition. Let me just show you another image where I use this idea again of queen and queen. Here you have the great Coretta Scott King, who is certainly a Black queen. And then of course, she's being held by an African. And then behind her, behind that photograph, is Versailles. So I think, you know what? I go much more into detail about the works, and I'm going to give it over, but I'll show you the piece that is in the Wadsworth now. So into hopes that you'll go and visit it, especially now that we're opening up. And I want to keep my statements brief because I'm really interested in getting to the panel and the discussion. So please, come and visit that museum and look at this piece, and go visit the website where I talk extensively about this piece and this work that's also being shown, and this work. And I think I'm going to stop right about now and let the other panelists jump in.
Okay, first of all, many, many thanks to Patty and Kimberly and Jana for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation about Todd Gris's work. I'm a historian. I will respond to this extraordinary constellation of works in the only way I know how, which is by offering you a history. Before I do that, though, I'd like to identify a couple of themes, entrenched oppositions, it turns out, that I see staged in Gris's work, oppositions crucial to the story that I'll be telling you. So consider, for example, this one, Francis, a work in which at least two sets of these oppositions are at work. First, between wilderness and civilization, between the wild growth enclosed by the smallest frame and civilization boxed in the next one. Second, the presumed opposition between land and landscape. The promise of wilderness, after all, is that it can be turned into productive land, and this is what we will see in the story I'll tell you. The land enclosed by the frame of the painting on the wall, by contrast, is land turned into landscape by virtue of being enclosed, so it can be enjoyed aesthetically. Gris's critical strategy here, it seems to me, is blocking. If one of the most central conceits of Western art is that a picture is a window into the world, in Gris's constellations of photographs, pictures obscure our view at the very moment that promise to open up windows. Portrait of Francis is ultimately produced, I would say, by that blocking. This strategy has the effect of preventing the entrenched oppositions that I mentioned from settling, unfolding, whatever you want to call it, oppositions that we take for granted, but that I want to show as being products of imperialism. So in my 10 minutes, I'll follow Gris's critical lead and ask, what are the historical connections between the supposed oppositions between wilderness and civilization, between land and landscape? So I'll try to answer this question by telling you a 19th century story that was known as the cinchona scheme, a project undertaken by the British government in the 1850s and 60s to cultivate the cinchona tree taken from Peru in plantations in India. Cinchona had great political importance at this moment because the drug quinine extracted from the plant's bark was used to treat malaria, which you can imagine was a perennial problem for the colonizing European. My story will also connect the dots between the kinds of gardens that you see in Gris's photographs. In this instance, not the exact ones that he talks about or he displays, but gardens in Utah, India on your left and Kew, UK, near London on your right. These gardens, I'll show, were crucial nodes in an imperial network. Behind these landscapes designed for aesthetic enjoyment, it turns out, were productive lands tied to a global economy. But for land to transform into landscape and back into productive land, the boundaries between wilderness and civilization had to be drawn and redrawn all over again. So what was the cinchona scheme? In the 17th century, Spanish Jesuit missionaries in Peru learned that locals could use the bark of the cinchona tree to treat malaria. By the turn of the 19th century, the medicinal properties of the cinchona were widely known, and by mid-century, the Dutch were successfully growing the plant in Java. Threatened by the prospect of a Dutch monopoly and concerned about the plant's rumored extinction, the British Secretary for India initiated the cinchona scheme in 1859 by asking a geographer by the name of Clement Markham to collect the plant's seeds from the forests of in southern Peru and bring them to London. A botanist, already in geographer who knew about the Andean mountains, a Kew-trained gardener and his wife, Markham embarked upon a biopiracy project in late 1859. The group identified the bitter quality species in the Peruvian forest, collected seeds. I'm saying collected, but they really essentially stole them. So seeds and sparks, as well as live plants. They packed 207 plants in 30 portable greenhouses called Wardian cases, so they could make the journey safely across the ocean around Cape Horn. This is before the Panama Canal. The plants arrived, most of them miraculously alive, in the Kew Gardens in August of 1860. Kew was one of the two gardens that I showed you a few slides ago. And they were propagated in forcing houses where they would multiply to 5,000 within the next year. While most of them were shipped off again to India from Kew, 6 cases of live plants as well as seeds were sent to West Indies and to Ceylon as an insurance policy of sorts. So the imperial network did not only transport these plants, but also served as a bank of sorts that distributed the risk of failure globally. The trickiest part of the project, however, to decide where in India the plant could be best cultivated. Kew and its subsidiaries offered advice by comparing the conditions in which the cinchona plants were found in South America to the ones in which they would be transplanted. And elevation, as geographers had noted decades ago, was crucial, but so were sun exposure, the nature of the soil, and so on and so forth. So they settled on that, on the parts that you see marked as green on this map. Kew botanists in London cross-referenced the data stored in the herbarium of the complex to figure out exactly where cinchona would be best cultivated. And they basically checked data from the species that they had on file against longitude, altitude, soil conditions, and so on to decide the best location for the plantations. So with approval from the Secretary of State for India and after negotiating with various botanists stationed in the subcontinent, Markham and his associates finally settled on the Nilgiri Mountains in the south. And Nilgiri Mountains not only had an elevation and climate analogous to the cinchona forest in South America, but also had the advantage of having nearby the hill station Otakamon, known today as Uti. And this is the site of the second garden that I showed you at the beginning. This was the summer headquarters of the government of Madras from 1861 onwards. It was used as a convalescent depot and the site of a sanitarium for the military in the 1830s. It was among the most important hill stations to gain prominence after 1857. And it basically became fashionable among the British to withdraw to higher elevations, which they believe protected them both from the rebellious natives and from the miasmatic fever range of cities. And as you see here, already Europeans are representing Uti in the European tradition of landscape painting. This in itself to me is interesting because Indian landscapes were frequently depicted as wastelands, demanding improvement by the British. So it was a civilizing mission to convert the unproductive land into productive land. Markham wrote that Uti reminded him as much of Peru as of English landscapes with rolling hills and so on. And he wrote, now that the roads are planted with tall trees, the hedges filled with the familiar flowers from old England, the place was as unlike India as it could be, and which he said is certainly not lessened by the rosy cheeks and healthy looks of the children. So the boundary between wilderness and civilization, once again, was a flimsy one, at least to European eyes. Furthermore, the nearby government gardens, designed as a series of terraces planted with European species, provided various conveniences, equipment, space, and above all, botanical expertise of Kew-trained gardeners. The first batch of seeds arrived in Otakamon in early 1861. They were propagated in forcing houses modeled on those at Kew. Live plants followed in April and were planted in terraces. And although the first sowing was unsuccessful, by June, there were over 2,000 plants. The following January, the number increased to almost 10,000. By the turn of the 20th century, cinchona plantations would take up 6,000 acres of the Indian countryside, rivaling those set up by the Dutch in Indonesia in that case. It takes labor, however, to make land productive. Soon enough, the British cinchona plantations in India were threatened by a labor shortage. It was as a result of a great deal of political maneuvering that the labor was found. In 1865, the Madras government sent 500 convicts as indentured laborers to the cinchona plantations. Thousands more followed during the famines of the 1870s. Meanwhile, other sites were identified for expanding the plantations, which meant even more labor was required. Eventually, in the 1880s, mechanized production was implemented to replace some of the manual labor, at which point there was a robust market for cinchona in London, and the Dutch were no longer the primary cinchona entrepreneurs. By then, Markham had already declared that the British transplantation of cinchona in India was a success. It did not seem to matter that, chemically speaking, the cinchona scheme was a failure. It was noted that second and third generation British cinchona contained significantly less alkaloid, thus producing much less effective quinine, the drug. Even then, the cinchona scheme was by all appearances a success. And not only because cinchona had been incorporated into the commodities market alongside sugar, tobacco, cotton, etc. While rebellion still seemed imminent and meltdowns in the global commodities market inevitable, the British government also managed to create some symbolic capital out of the cinchona affair by publicizing its program to sell quinine at every Indian post office. Here, actually, you see the white colonizer handing the cinchona to locals of all places in a botanic garden. If the cinchona scheme was successful at all, it was to the extent that it created the illusion of a stable body politic that carried out a civilizing mission, not the fragile network of conflicting actors and institutions that I've been trying to describe to you, a network on the verge of being destroyed by ships sinking, plants dying, economies melting down, or masses rebelling, but a robust entity held together by the promise of making civilization out of wilderness. To all hold on to an intrinsic opposition between productive land and aesthetic landscape, or between civilization and wilderness, then, is to hold on to concepts handed down to us by a history of violent imperialism. Thank you.
So my name is Nilika Jawad, and first I'd like to thank Todd Gray, who I met by chance at a Black Portraitures conference some years ago, and that he invited me to think and write about his work. And thank you so much, Jana Israel and the Wadsworth Athenaeum Museum of Art for inviting me to speak today. So I'd grown up outside of Sri Lanka, which is the birthplace of my parents. My parents had immigrated from Sri Lanka to Zambia in the late 1970s, years before anyone in Sri Lanka could imagine that there would be a civil war that would last over a quarter of a century there. They left the island before the series of pogroms targeting Tamil people, the most infamous of which was Black July in 1983, and the years of war had begun. My father tuned the shortwave radio to hear the BBC's World Services faithfully at 6 a.m. every morning. Often we only heard a one-line sentence about a bombing, a burning, a spate of killings in between the crackling and popping on the shortwave radio, followed by my father's frantic attempts to make phone calls calls he could not afford at that time to his brothers in Colombo. Would you mind slowing down with the slides for a minute? And then we'll keep going. But these dispatches about an island devolving into rebel attacks, bombings, state-sponsored murder, and endless calamities receded into the back of my consciousness. I grew up in a different political cauldron, the politics of Southern Africa, apartheid in South Africa, Ian White's naked white supremacist poison in Rhodesia to the south, civil wars in Mozambique and Angola, and the clandestine involvement of South African special ops in both countries, and the rumors of Cuban and Soviet training programs for soldiers engaged in each one of these wars. For most of my life, I sought to erase my difference and unease, those overlapping histories in myself. By the time I went to university in the US, Sri Lanka had reduced into a background note. As I studied myself as a scholar and writer, I found that I was drawn to images, to photographs taken in the disputed narrative terrains of my own backyard. Instinctually, I knew how to read the politics of those images, how to identify the narratives that photographs added to, altered, and challenged. I was interested in the story that each photograph, especially those purporting to be documentary photographs, told. Did it matter who took the photograph? What were the narratives the photographed carried with them, often unconsciously? And how did those silent ideological streams inform their image-making practices and the ways in which they framed what they saw? To whom were these images disseminated, and for what purpose? What did a photograph leave out? What did it highlight? And how was it retelling a story that shaped by ideologies that lurked within the publics that would internalize these photographs into their own world-making projects, along with histories, biases, structures that they themselves remained unaware of? So in my early years with photography, I really jumped without a parachute, held aloft by the heady rhetoric of the South African photographers whose work I was writing about. Their photographs helped me find words to describe my own position, direct my own political journey, and navigate the uncomfortable terrain of identity and belonging. In many ways, I was working out a problem or a set of personal problems through thinking, inquiring, writing about photographs. Looking through the archives was emotional, intellectual, and political cartography. Next slide, please. It was during the 2000s when I began returning every year to South Africa and to Zambia to see my family, to work on literary scholarship, that I met South African documentary photographers who were part of the anti-apartheid movement. And I learned about the Afropix collective and 8 photographers agency. During the 80s, they were one of the most influential collectives in the country. Afropix photographers came from a range of social, economic, and racial backgrounds. And they wanted to challenge the repressive apartheid policies directly, and the National Party's virulent police apparatus. Artists and cultural workers, members of fast food workers unions, university students, faith-based organizations, and members of the radical oppositional press came together despite their differences in racial, cultural, class, and political opinions. Their goal, nothing short of regime change from within, using their own collective power. Next slide, please. This collective spirit, evident throughout the 80s, organized resistance to apartheid, was instrumental in the formation of this photographers collective. They dedicated themselves to exposing the lies behind the regime's propaganda, using photography as their medium. They embraced the philosophy and principles of social documentary photography and were motivated by the imperative to make things visible, transparent, and be witnesses. But many Afropix photographers took it even further to a more radical approach. At the influential Culture and Resistance Symposium and Festival held in Botswana in June 1982, Peter Mackenzie, who was at the time the first so-called colored person to attend the Durban Technikon to study photography, famously stated in no uncertain terms that the committed photographer must not, quote, not only take sides and accept responsibility to participate in the struggle, but also use their cameras as weapons in the liberation struggle. So the camera became a weapon of truth. The ultimate goal was the desire to use photography as a political tool in the liberation struggle. They wanted to create a radical oppositional image bank to counter the surfeit of propaganda images, and they saw their images as documentary truth. So even today, when I look over their archives, each photographer held fast to the truth quality of the photograph and its potential for challenging a powerful racist regime and its lies. So that was my scholarship, and where I found footing as a scholar. It was also where I laid down my political heart. But in the background was the history I avoided, the island of my parents' birth, Sri Lanka, which by the time I began publishing as a writer and scholar was deep into a second decade of civil war. Maybe working with South African photographers' work opened a path for me to return to the things I did not yet have the courage to face or the words to articulate. Would you mind forwarding to the final slide? To number 8. I began locking sections of Sri Lanka's story into place with mine, filling voids into the landscape of my jigsaw puzzle. I delved into the printed text written by journalists and scholars. I scanned through blog posts, web projects, and social media posts, which during the early aughts were becoming the mediums that immigrants were using to chronicle personal narratives. They were locations of expression for the diasporic and the dispossessed who could not access formal publication avenues. These narratives provided the antidote to the ephemeral quality of newspaper articles that reduced their experiences to a quote, an insufferable nature of scholarly writing, which refused to speak about feelings, anger, damage. In that vast field of images that claim to document Sri Lanka's disputed narratives, I can identify 3 broad categories. First, there are images signed off by the state in service of heroism of its armed forces, the horror of its victims of bombings of Buddhist temples, train stations, and buses in predominantly Sinhala majority areas, and Tamil dissidents who were killed by the Tamil Tigers to silence them. Second, there's a significant body of war photographers' work that also stands witness to the lie created by the state's propaganda, maintaining a record of the brutality that the island's smiling people are capable of. Some, if the photographer was formerly attached to a news agency or journal, are now maintained in the formal archives. In the case of many local Sri Lankan photographers, however, their archives decay in their own homes and offices. And third, from the first decade of the 2000s, there are thousands of pixelated digital camera and grainy cell phone images, some taken by soldiers as they brutalized, shot, and pushed bodies, some still alive, into shallow graves. And these photographs emerged on the internet, showing graphic evidence of mass killings and the presence of identifiable troop commanders. But this living archive, grainy photographs, blog posts, bootleg videos posted on Facebook and later Twitter, had none of the assurance that South African documentary photographers' work did. I could not position my feet into that shifting quicksand. In 2009, a number of videos, most likely taken by members of Sri Lankan armed forces, were leaked. Some were posted on social media. Only 3 months after our current president ebulliently declared a victory over the rebel Tamil Tigers, Channel 4 News in Britain broadcast a video showing men wearing Sri Lankan armed forces uniforms firing their assault rifles at 2 naked, blindfolded and bound men sitting on muddy ground. A general, a major general, is present on the scene of a mass execution. I can hear soldiers making crude sexual remarks and suggestive comments about violating the women in the group in Sinhala, my parents' language. The digital timestamp on the video shows that it was 3:17 p.m. on the 18th of May, 2009. But then the president of the country, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and his government spokespersons react to the same way they always have, asserting that the country has a right to make inquiries of it on their own, using its own people and their own methodologies without foreign interference, and casting doubt on the authenticity of the footage. An official immediately announced that 4 of their own hand-picked investigators, 2 of whom were government officials, had concluded that the videos were, quote, fake. So far, all the acts of exposing and all the acts of truth-telling by video and documentary photography has had no effect whatsoever. And so when I got to looking through Todd's work, I started thinking about the limits of that documentary photography. And it really, I had to spend some years thinking about it because I had spent so much time attached to the idea of truth-telling and the documentary. This slide shows some work by Joe Ratcliffe, who's a South African photographer and artist who began moving away from documentary photography as the go-to medium for truth-telling, because it became clear, despite the Truth and Reconciliation Commission spillages and gaudy hopes for a rainbow nation, that the state would rather subsume unruly remainders of 4 centuries of colonial genocide and the violent remainders of apartheid and the neo-colonial present. So I won't go on this too long, and I want to move on to the next slide, if you could, please. These photographs were taken by a photographer that I know, but for her safety, or for their safety, they've asked not to be named. The last time I was in Sri Lanka, before my mother's death, I stayed in the ancestral home that she inherited from her family. Each day at dawn, I meditated on what it means to be part of a tradition-bound, privileged group who reinforce their powerful positions. I traced the threads of militaristic rhetoric in Sri Lanka's ancient religious texts, in the Sri Lankan Buddhist go-to holy works, which were written by powerful Buddhist monks who were part of elite temples, and the versions of history that those texts impart. I think about the monks who represent a religious practice of renunciation, but whose incendiary political rhetoric, beatific faces, poetic words, expounding on Sinhala Buddhist right to this paradise, have laid waste to the lives of the island's others. Next slide, please. I think about what it means to have been born in a country that orchestrated a genocide, but buried it under the rhetoric of self and tradition preservation. If in other well-documented cases of genocidal wars, Rwanda, Germany, Bosnia, there is an acknowledgement, however problematic and continually denied by certain factions. What happens when an acknowledgement has not been forthcoming? How can photography work on this island? Is there value in documenting, in stating truth here? I'd brought Ariella Azule's The Civil Contract of Photography with me on the plane. It was my pillow. I sit on the veranda of my mother's home, where all my ancestors have sat, before anyone else in this house wakes up. Azule proposes that photography creates a, quote, civil contract, wherein those who engaging in the spectatorship are called to their, quote, civic duty towards the photographed persons who have not stopped being there, towards dispossessed citizens who in turn enable the rethinking of the concept and practice of citizenship. Even if the nation state divides those it governs, she writes, partitioning off those it deems non-citizens from citizens and mobilizes through incendiary national rhetoric and incitements to violent action, those it privileges against other groups who are attempting to be recognized as citizens, the relational, horizontal contract towards one another remains. But even if I no longer have a passport from Sri Lanka, I still remain Sinhala, Buddhist, identifiable by my surname, my clan name, and claimed when I do something noteworthy by those with privileged citizenship. I am admonished and reminded not to forget where I come from. It is only when I critique that broken contract between the nation and those who have been uncitizened that I'm told that I have no rights to speak of these things, since I was not living in the country now or then. I know this seesawing rejection from a nation to recovery of citizenship, though that seemingly warm embrace too is often done without acquiescence all too well. Next slide, please. Within that space of seesawing motion, I wonder, as Azulay does, how my citizenship, tenuous and fraught though it may be, might be revoked, renegotiated, through the act of engaging with this image field, much like the way Todd Gray does, through questioning documentary, through questioning the veracity of the kinds of truth that the state tells, through juxtaposing the spiritual and signaling towards a truth beyond the documentary, regardless of whether the nation state, its representatives, its rulers, and goons allow me the right of entry or not. Thank you.
Well, thank you each for those powerful presentations. I'd like to invite Patty Hickson, the Contemporary Curator of Art for the Wadsworth Athenaeum, to join us in the conversation. Patty?
Thanks, Kimberly. Those were incredible presentations. I'm just so moved. So I wanted to, given Nilika's presentation just concluded, Todd, I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about your work. Your work, in a sense, is documentary, and you keep an archive. But in what way do you really look at your work as a way of exposing truth?
Well, actually, what I do, I think, is like, oh, am I muted? No, you're hearing me. Okay, great. I think I challenge the veracity of the photograph. And we, as Nilika pointed out, we take a photograph to be evidentiary, to be truth. But it's contextual. It's who made the photograph? Where does it appear? What is there a subtext, or is there a caption to it? Who's presenting it? You know, there's so many variables that can modify the meaning. And what I really set forth and put forth in my work is to get the viewers to think critically. So I obscure, as Zainab was saying, I obscure parts of the photograph and I cover things up so that the viewer has to then become active and going, hey, what's going on? What's covered up? What is happening? So they have to interrogate the photograph and not just consume it and digest it whole without thinking critically. So in that way, I challenge the veracity of the photograph, because I think in this day and age, you can't trust it. You can't trust it. You have to inquire and then come up with your own with your own meaning. So that's how. And actually, I want to challenge something else.
Yeah.
You say that my photos, or whether you're saying is documentary. The photo is a document, but every photo is a document. And I do work 99% from my archive. I'm old school. I've taken all the photographs that I show, except for the ones of the cosmos. Those come from the Hubble spacecraft. But yeah, I have these archives that span 40 years of all the photos I've taken as a commercial photographer, as an art photographer, and so forth. But yeah, the ones I use are primarily unmanipulated and so forth. And so they're straight, what is called straight photography.
If I may jump in, it seems to me it's also the blocking as a strategy to what you could say, I mean, in a very Foucauldian manner, to historicize. I mean, I would have to tell you an entire story about how those gardens were involved in a long history of imperialism. And I think what Todd's work does is do the work of historization through formal means of occluding or blocking or obscuring. That is a way to undermine the veracity of the documentation, and even beyond photography, I think the veracity that is claimed by a certain kind of architecture, for example, in some of the examples that you show, which just by virtue of their symmetry, for example, project a kind of order that an order that imposes itself on the world, or the gardens for that matter. So these objects already project a certain kind of power, and then the photographs imbue them with this evidentiary kind of aura. And then there, you could either I mean, I see it as very, I mean, Todd, I don't know if you would agree, but I mean, I know you've been influenced by Foucault, but it's a very Foucauldian move. What you're doing is to historicize it all in a way. I mean, the other option would be to historicize.
I agree totally. And also the way I use round frames, they become time portals. And people have said, I'll put these round frames in certain positions, and it's almost like it's creating a time portal that you have to look in and think, and you're now thinking or relating to a different place and time. So when there is a round image of a sailboats that are from the 17th century, that I took at a photograph in a museum, and then they're placed in a contemporary scene, I'm holding those two historic positions in the same visual plane. The 17th century, the sailboats, which are signifying, of course, the slave ships, and then the Atlantic Ocean, and Black people, West Africans, Ghanaians, standing on that shore, looking out. Yet right next to them is an image of a slave ship, of the sailboats. So yes, I'm definitely playing with history and creating these wormholes, if you will, or portals that you can go in and come out. It's as rich as the imagination or the historical context that the viewer can conjure up. So yeah, I'm certainly playing with those signifiers.
Todd, I hadn't realized that even when I had written about your work, that the different kinds of frames signify different kinds of conversations, and symbolically, like that the round frames were sort of portals for entry. I hadn't even thought of that, but that would have been lovely to include.
I wanted to jump. You're going to have an easy time as a moderator, Patty, because we're going to
take it away.
There was something also, Zainab, I photographed in the Palm, what is it called? In the
Palm House. Yeah.
The Palm House, and and so here we have examples of all of the plants that were from the lands that were under control of the British Empire.
Yeah.
And it was just to see that Palm House in your presentation, it really gave even more gravitas, even more weight to the images that I've made where I've used those, because not only were the British controlling the plants and the land, that when you were talking about the quinine and so forth, the same thing were happening with the dark bodies.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And, the land,
yeah. So another thing, that's why I chose Francis, because there's something really powerful about the black body being, it's a portrait. I don't know if you'd agree if it's a portrait at the end of the day, but much of what's obscured is also the labor history that I tried to get into a little bit. It's a brutal, terrible history that
Nilika wrote this brilliant essay in my catalog for Euclidian Gris, which was about how the colonizers would use photography to control those who they had colonized. Nilika, how you're saying they would resist by a blank face, or can you say a little more about that? Because that's really been in my head.
I was thinking about how, the way that you're using the masking and signaling to the conversation that you have about masking and not showing your person. And, the colonial project, a big part of it was like categorizing which natives were which. And then kind of saying, these are the ones that we like because they're easy to control. And these are the kind of wild and crazy ones. And then, the good native, the bad native, and everything in between. And also creating nice types that we could never then leave, and how tribal categories were created in both South Asia and Southeast Asia, and in all parts of Africa, how tribal categories were associated with our identification cards, and then later with, essentially our passports. And so, and how we did not get to move between our categories as we normally would have before we were documented in those kinds of ways, photographically, as well as in like identification documentation. And part of the resistance was to present that wooden face to the camera. And perhaps it's also because, even in early photography, white Europeans did not smile for the camera because the shutter speed was so slow, any kind of movement would have not worked. There's a whole book about the history of the smile in photography, which I love. And also people's teeth were not that great. It wasn't a good thing to be like just showing off your teeth like that. And so people did not smile. They showed stoicism. And it was a very somber occasion because photography was very, like it was a special occasion. Only the people with money could do it. So it wasn't just Africans or Asians who were somber for the camera. Europeans were too. But there is conversation about how that stoicism, we've always used that kind of blank face when we do that even now. When we're around our like kind of corporate or academic situations where people are talking that we have to attend that diversity seminar where it is so violent, and and they're so awful, and it's like some horrible module that's more racist than anything that you've experienced, or one of the many things, and the stoic and the blank face is really your resistance. And what mostly the colonizer or the powerful group often thinks is that you're stupid because you don't have expression. And so that kind of sliding signifier of the unreadable face of the native is really interesting, which is something that you're playing with in your work.
Are there questions, Patty? Are there some more questions?
Yeah, so I'll ask some questions from inside the chat. So Todd, do you have specific strategies on how to get people to slow down and look at the images in this culture of people who are like fast looking and moving on? So in your work, I think we just talked about one by covering faces and you want to peek behind some of the framing, but can you talk a little bit about some of the other strategies?
Yeah. Well, my base strategy is to get people to detach from the expectation that a photograph is a statement. Normally, when you look at a photograph, you're being given information, it's a statement, it's a sentence, it's a proclamation. So what I do is I make the photograph a question. And so a question means there's an answer. So that's how I try to get the viewer to come into my mindscape, is to cover up things. So then I use the fight or flight mechanism that we all share. By obscuring the identification of an object, of a person, of a place, you have to go, wait, is this, you can't define it. And the brain wants to solve that because the brain is there to make you survive. How does it make you survive? Am I gonna fight or am I gonna run? So you have to answer the question of identifying. And I use that psychological mechanism to invite the viewer in and to create a dialogue by covering things over and creating a question. So that's the strategy that I use. And hopefully the person that asked that they'll look at my work and they'll go, wait, what's happening? As soon as you go, what is this? What's happening? I've reeled you in.
That's how I started with it, Todd, when I first saw your work. So there's a question for Zeynep. Can you talk a little bit about where the quinine industry is today? Does it still go on? Is it done? Is there any, was there any remedy to the weakening of the medicinal qualities of the plant?
You know, that's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I would think the malaria would be. I mean, first of all, you know, I don't know the answer, but of course, I don't know if they produce quinine anymore, but I would have to research that. But what's interesting, maybe historically, is that the emphasis on quinine shifted to emphasis on, especially after the emergence of germ theory, to, for example, mosquitoes, right? So it became a development project to get rid of mosquitoes. So the burden of the civilizing mission was no longer on the back of quinine to be, in a way, and got on the back of the mosquitoes. So, but I don't know if anybody produces quinine anymore. That's a great question. I should know that.
I want to add something to that. I was in Ghana the first time in 1992. So I was there with Stevie Wonder to shoot a album cover for him. In any event, I went out to the village, this village in the Western region, and I was speaking to one of the chiefs, what's called a Nana, and he was saying that his grandfather was telling him there was a local root, and that root was a remedy to a specific ailment for that region, and they gave it to the Brits when they got sick. And then what happened is they got that root, sent it to the UK, were able to make a chemical out of it, brought that back, these pills, and then outlawed the use of the root. And you had to buy the pills. And that's how all of that control, whatever can be commodified and enforced, so there's natural remedies, boom, it's turned into technology and then a price tag and so forth. So if it was happening back in the 19th century, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's happening now.
Well, but I mean, it's also interesting that the indigenous knowledge is co-opted and then very quickly banned in this case, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Zeynep, somebody was asking about in the questions, and also Todd, about, you know, the discussion is a lot of the average person from the public wouldn't have this history about imperial garden practices and about all this kind of colonial taming and how those plants were transported to Europe into places like Kew Gardens, or you know, that whole project, and how that relationship layers and helps us kind of add depth to Todd's work. And when that person goes to see it and they're wondering about, like, will there be videos and stuff? Maybe you should think about putting a video, adding a video to the exhibition, so that have a discussion that where this could be informative. I think it would be so rich for each person's experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a question for Patty and Jana, really, not for me.
No, you know, what's fascinating is that, you know, these are layered narratives that, you know, and also they have counterparts in other areas too. And I think that's what's so fascinating about the work, is that, you know, it kind of unlocks this idea and suddenly you see it everywhere. And so there are just so many layers, and a program like this kind of unlocks those other connections that kind of broaden the content of the exhibition in a really nice way.
I mean, on that note, can I ask Todd a question? I know I'm very curious about the, I mean, I use the word constellation and I meant it, not because you use imagery from the, the astronomical images, but there's a logic to the use of these histories. And so, I mean, for example, in the Frankfurt School, the idea of a constellation is a very specific thing that it's precisely that. It's like an arrangement of concepts that is not in any way hierarchical, but could unlock things at any moment in any order. I think in a way, so, maybe one way to answer that last question is, there are other constellations that are unlocked here. And I just told you a story about one of them. I mean, would you agree with that, Todd? I mean, the idea of the constellation.
I think that's an apt metaphor. And I also think that I'm putting different historical epochs together. And I'm not putting them, history, it does not run like this. And it's not history, it's histories. It's a plurality. And the histories unfold depending on who's telling it. And so what I'm trying to do is place multiple histories in a visual plane, and then telling them from telling it from my position. It's like, what is it? I think it was Howard Zinn who was saying, you need to talk about big game hunting, but from the position of the lion instead of the hunter. To have a totally different view, same activity, but from a different point of view. So I'm trying to put multiple points of narrative together. So yeah, cosmologies, I definitely welcome that.
And also thinking about cosmologies, I think, different cultures read the stars very differently and have very different narratives and different formations. In the same body of stars, we'll have a different picture altogether and a completely different mythology attached to the same kind of, set of bright points in the sky. And I know like Malians have a variety of stories, and Sri Lankans have a variety of stories. The country area I grew up in, Southern Africa, different groups will have different stories. And then when I realized like I'm a Libra in the Western mythology, that makes no sense to me whatsoever. And so that tells you that we can have the same kind of events, and that your work is like putting frames to different parts of that cosmology that helps us focus on a certain set of narrative that could come out of it. But if you shift that frame to a different portion, an entirely different cosmology will be revealed. An entirely different story will be revealed.
In the piece in the Wadsworth, the big 30-foot sumptuous memories of plundering kings, if you go from left to right, the first image is of an angel, but the angel is upside down. And then you go to the next image or so, and it's of a spirit figure from specifically from Nigeria, called an echo, an eo. And so I'm putting, and I'm upending the traditional angel and foregrounding this Nigerian spirit, because in this culture, in Western culture, in the way I was raised, the angel is at the highest plane, and everything else is sort of superstitious and so forth. But I'm so as you were, I'm not creating new hierarchies, but I'm trying to upend old ones.
Yeah. I see.
And it's interesting because as much as there are these different narratives, there are also parallel narratives that, you're bringing into focus rather than, like you said, upending and highlighting other narratives.
Well, I not to offend, I was brought up a Catholic, and not to offend, but when we say a person fed the multitudes with one fish and one loaf of bread, turned wine into water, and that's the truth. Yet a person that can turn from a monkey into a tree, or can turn from a spider into something other creature in this animus in West African mythology, that's uncivilized and that's just completely low culture and that's crazy thinking. Well, that's what gives me pause. I think it was after reading the South African writer Francis Namanjo. He's a cultural anthropologist at the University of Cape Town. And after reading him, and Amos Tutula, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, and he was talking about it in these relationships, how mythologies in Africa are superstition, but miracles in the West are to be worshipped. He was going, is that so? It's subjective, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see, we're past an hour, which is our usual time limit. So I just want to see if there's anything.
Maybe most of the listeners or viewers have dropped off already.
Not yet.
No, they're still here with you.
Yes. There's a comment, not a question, about the sheer aesthetic beauty of the frames and the images and their composition seem to be another tool to seduce in order to lure the viewer towards deeper themes and readings. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hopefully the work is broad. I mean, my arms are broad and welcoming. And I think that's what photography does, because everyone understands a photograph. And so they don't feel intimidated or they don't feel, oh, this is crazy stuff I don't get. It's a photograph, and we all understand how to read a photograph. Mm-hmm. And so I'm using everyone's knowledge of fluence, their photo fluency, their media fluency, their ability to read. And then I'm introducing completely different sentences. And so it's in reading these different poems. And in reading these poems, they have to, work it out. But yeah, I definitely like that. And some of my frames, even from Soweto and from Johannesburg. Mm-hmm. So when I travel to Africa, I pick up frames. So there's hopefully the signifiers or the semiotics are in the materials that I use and not in the photographs. Yeah, everything. Mm-hmm. Great.
Someone did ask what the first spark to create these assemblages or collages of images. Where did that first spark come from to
my need to challenge photography, my need to challenge the normativity in culture, normativity in art, my need to acknowledge that in our culture, the pastiche, the collage, hip hop is collage. Hip hop is collage. It's cut and paste different musical frames together. I mean, early hip hop, you get a song from a cool beat, then you put something on top. That's collage. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is the language that is most pertinent for our time and space. This is to put various things together. So singularity, no, it's multiplicity. Singularity, no. Multiplicity, yes. Mm-hmm. Binaries, good, bad, no. Polymorphous multiplicities, yes.
But I think it's really fascinating to think of the kind of collage this is. I think it was Jana that made a comment in the chat about collage and constellation, because I mean, classic collage in modern art is frequently a matter of shock, whereas this idea of opening and closing windows in constellations, I think, is a very specific kind of collage that is different from many others that we know of. It's really I find it very inventive, and it's the combination of the collage technique and the constellation idea.
In a way, I think also it's from Black culture. You have to throw down and throw down hard. Like in basketball vernacular, in music, you got to throw down and make your mark. And I think that's what I was also thinking. How do I put that ball in a basket in a way that no one else does it? And so the style of that. So part of me, which to me comes out of Black culture, is how do I present a photograph in a way that's never been presented before and that is singular and reflects my singularity in that way. And so that's where the aesthetic choices come and everything. And so I think that comes from my history in Black culture, you know, and just seeing in song, in music, in the arts, in all sorts of ways. How can you throw down in a way that nobody else can throw down? That's what I'm trying to do.
Why doesn't Nilika answer that last question, and then you can all say something, and I think maybe.
Oh, about the photographer's work, whose work I was speaking
Yes.
about.
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking about, you know, looking through, as I'd written about Todd's work, I think it was last year or even the year before when we started speaking about it, and looking through how you were doing that layering of narratives to put things that were contested together. How do you say, this is what's happening in Versailles or in Kew Gardens, and what was happening 300 years ago, 400 years ago, and how much violence there was and how much beauty there is at the same time, and how do you put that together in an image? And I was thinking about how I didn't feel necessarily my place in the narrative of Sri Lanka, and unless I'm just all for the national story and all for the dominant narrative and doing incredible things, then you know, the whole island is ready to adopt you and hooray you. So I saw this photographer's work elsewhere, other work, and I contacted them and we spoke for a while, and I didn't have an understanding of how to really write about that work as an academic, because it's not my area. I don't know anything about South Asian work, let alone Sri Lankan history as an outsider, really. And they said, I can't have you write this narrative that you're trying to with my work, with my name identified to it, because there will be a lot of problems for me, because it is such a violent place, and they will not be able to go back and work with the communities that they have photographed if they know, and if the state knows that this is what I'm writing and this has been her work, revealing the disappeared and the families of those survivors, all of that. And so we worked with photographs that allude to disappearance and to the unknowable and the impossibility of truth. And we found images, or she sent me, sorry, they sent me a huge cache of photographs. And I went through them looking at what works with this thing that I'm thinking about. And those were some of the images that were working with those illusions. So they are not doing what you're doing, Todd, which is collaging things. And the collage in our work together is our two sets of narratives. And perhaps even the fact that I'm thinking through them as an outsider and saying it and coming at it through how important documentary was to South African photographers, which is my, real scholarship, or my more self-assured scholarship, I would say, or the scholarship in which I feel I have a better footing. And all those layers are the collage through which I'm hoping that whoever reads it, if anybody reads it, will get to see, and they will have to make their own decisions about what images can do and what contested narratives can do, and that you have to hold all that together in your hands.
Contested narratives, narratives, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a wonderful program. Yeah, go ahead, Todd.
Okay, but someone said, how did I get these ideas and everything? And as I was listening to Nilika, it's from reading, actually. And it's from reading Stuart Hall, Edward Glissant, Bachelard, Bell Hooks, Toni Morrison, Foucault, W.E.B. Du Bois, or Dubois, but Du Bois. It's from reading all of these people and then all of these ideas. So when you start thinking, you have about 8 other scholars in your head and they influence you. So reading actually really helped unlock the visual. And so I just wanted to give my propers to all of those teachers.
Yes, and they're young, today writers that are influencing us too. I want to give a shout out to Kaguru Macharia, who's a Kenyan or Kenya-based writer, and to Christina Sharp, who.
Oh, Christina, yes,
I
After the
know.
Wake, yes.
This is wake work.
Yeah,
And,
wake work.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Atlantic Ocean.
Rinaldo Walcott as well.
Patricia, the Atlantic Ocean that's in the Sails Blow or Gosh.
Yeah.
That image of the Atlantic, that's after I read the Christina Sharp book, that really put me in tune with the Atlantic. And that got, I mean, here's a direct response from reading a great scholar, and then boom, an image appears. But I know we're over time, so thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, so, Kimberly, did you want to give the final salute to the evening?
I was just going to close us out, but if you'd like to, Patty, you can.
Well, I did want to say that the Wadsworth and the Amistad Center are open Fridays through Sundays, Fridays noon to 8 p.m. and Saturday and Sunday from 12 to 5. And Todd's show is up until July 18th. So I hope people will come see.
Thanks, Sunny. Thank you, Nilika. Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful.
Great papers. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, everyone.
Great
Thank you
meeting
for
everyone.
attending.
Bye.